Okay, sorry. Okay, yeah, got it.
Yes,
Good.
hello and welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined by Angel Escamilla Garcia. Uh, he's a PhD candidate in sociology and a Presidential Fellow at Northwestern University. His research focuses on how migrant youth negotiate high-risk environments. His current project uses ethnographic methods and interviews to explore the different strategies that Central American youth used to migrate through Mexico on their way to the United States. Since 2015, he has spent extensive time along the migrant route in Mexico and has interviewed Central American migrants as well as a wide range of officials, aid workers, and stakeholders. His research reveals the capacity of Central American migrant youth to constantly adapt to the circumstances, employing a wide range of tactics to avoid the harms, dangers of moving through Mexico. Ankel has also studies the role of rumor, reputation, legal consciousness, and illegality in shaping youth's journeys. And his research challenges the characterization of migrant journeys as linear events and sheds important light on the role of journeys in shaping overall migration flows. So, Angel, so welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Larry. How are you?
Oh, doing very well. So yeah, that's a very interesting research area. So I think, but I think we should maybe first talk about, maybe your own upbringing and what ultimately brought you to the research. So where did you grow up, and yeah, just introduce yourself broadly a little bit.
Sure. Well, I'm originally from Chiapas, which is uh, the state of Mexico that borders Guatemala. So I'm from the southern border of Mexico, and culturally, Chiapas is very connected to Central America. So I always felt very connected to the culture of Central America. Like I don't eat spicy food because in the South we don't eat spicy food, and Mexicans usually do, right? It's a common belief. So I always feel very connected to this culture, and that's where I was born. And then I moved to Veracruz, which is a state that is kind of in central Mexico, and I study anthropology there. Uh, Originally, I studied race mostly. When while there, then after I graduated from anthropology, I moved to Texas, where I worked as a paralegal. This was 2015, and I worked as a paralegal to provide legal services to unaccompanied minors. This was 2015. I don't know if you remember, but there was this migrant crisis, the search of migrant children arriving to the border of Texas, and all these children came from Central America. Nobody knew what to do with them. Uh, the border patrol didn't know what to do with them. At the time, I was like part of this organization that was right in the border, and what we did was like try to provide legal services to this kind of huge amount of children. I remember when I was there, there was a point in which every day the border patrol detained around 500 kids. Every day there were 500 kids who crossed the border. That seems a lot. That's nothing compared to today's number. So what I found is that as someone who is from Mexico, but also from southern Mexico, what I found interesting is like uh, all these kids need to cross Mexico to reach the US, right? And as someone from Mexico who knows how diverse it is, I was like, well, this is not just like a one journey, right? It's very something like an entire adventure, right? There is tons of things that can happen there, different cultures, different types of territories, different types of like challenges, opportunities. So when I finished my work as a paralegal and I went to do my PhD in sociology at Northwestern, I decided that I wanted to study this migrant journey from a very qualitative perspective to see how they experience this movement across Mexico. Yeah, that's how I came up with this idea.
So it was mainly your experience as a paralegal, in Texas. I mean, handling the unaccompanied minors, that made you
Yes.
interested in the narratives, the stories. Uh, yeah. And yeah, so talk a little bit then about the dissertation work. So I must assume so you went back to that a border region, or I mean, how did you find your I guess research
Yeah,
subjects for study?
yeah. So so when I start to do my actual fieldwork in Northwest, when I went to Mexico, I originally went to the field thinking that I was going to find like strategies. I was trying to find how youth made it, how they avoid violence and keep moving, right? I was trying to see the agency that children have and youth have, and well, when I went, one of my points was to focus not just in the border areas, but to first focus in the entire country as a general, to go through different places. So I tried to cover as many places as possible. I covered around 23 different places, and 17 places in which I stayed for like longer periods, for like from 2 weeks to 1 month. Right? And what I found was a very different picture for what I was looking for. That's kind of what qualitative research often entails. You are trying to find something who you think matches what theory says or what previous theory says, and then when you go there, you find that reality is much more different. What I found is that these youth sometimes, most of these youth do move in a very precarious situation, like because what I found is that most of the kids, most of the unaccompanied minors that you see at the border are arriving with the help of smugglers or with their families, And I was focusing on the ones who travel by themselves, something that I call truly unaccompanied minors. So I was like, I just want to focus on those who are literally by themselves, just a youth of 17, 18, 11, 12 years old. And that's a very different experience because imagine you without the support of migrant networks, without like someone who already knows how to move to these places, without money because they often lack money to move, without money to pay bribes or to pay for food or to pay for transportation, without proper documentation to move freely. What I found is that it's about violence. So these kids want to move from place A to place B, but as soon as they enter Mexico, they realize that there is a chance that they will face some sort of precarity of violence, no matter what they do. Something bad is going to happen to you, no matter what you do. While you try to move from A to B. So what do you do? And what I found is like they realize that they cannot completely escape violence. So instead, they negotiate with it. They try to negotiate with violence, which means like they try to make decisions in this precarious environment to try to avoid violence in as much as possible, but at the same time to improve their movement and to improve their well-being, which means like if I cannot move, at least I want to find food, at least I want to like preserve my life or like things like that. And this is the constant negotiation that happens in the migrant journey between trying to avoid violence and keep moving or keep like being alive, if you want to call it. It's this is imperfect because they do it in a very precarious situation. As I told you, they don't know exactly what is ahead. They don't have resources to move in a different way. There is again a wide range of actors, laws who are designed explicitly to, either deport them, detain them, or like, rob them, kidnap them, torture them, rape them, you name it. And they don't know exactly how or where to go. So it's a very chaotic situation. And what I found is that in this journey, in which they are negotiating with violence, their journeys become transformed. They start to be like changed. The duration of the journey changed. Their final destination changed. The way they see Mexico changes. So I feel like my research really talks about this. How this incredible externalization of the border that Mexico is doing is transforming the classic stream of international migration, which is like leaving A and arrive to B, right? Leaving Central America and arriving to the US. I don't think this works like that anymore.
Okay, so there's a lot of listeners who are not experts in migration policy and history, and also not experts in Central America. So maybe you want to step back for a moment and give us a little overview of the political economy in Central America. I mean, especially the states that you mentioned, I guess the triangle countries in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. What is the political economy situation that is
Yeah,
causing the migration wave? And then the second would be, how does the Mexican state respond to
yeah,
migration waves, I mean, over time? And then lastly, how does the United States, like once the accompanied minors are showing up in the US-Mexico border, how do they respond to migration?
yeah. No, yeah, good question. I feel generally migration from Latin America to the US has been generally, at least from the southern border, has been generally about Mexican migrants, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, there's been Mexican migrants. And the classic model of Mexican migration is the model of like adult men who are moving to work in the United States and their families are waiting in Mexico. That used to be the model. Now, in Central America, which is this set of little countries who are below Mexico, this is like these countries have kind of like generally a very precarious government and history of like U.S. intervention, at political level, at economic level. For example, Honduras and El Salvador. Honduras mostly was at some point highly controlled by U.S. corporations that had like banana plantations there, and in order to protect their interests, they played with like local governments to preserve their power in these areas. There is also like intervention of like actual military aid provided by the U.S. in El Salvador to protect the government that was perceived as anti-communist. It was during the 80s and 90s. So there is a lot of history around these countries. All but Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador are three countries which are often called the Northern Triangle of Central America. So the three countries who are in the northern part of Central America, and then the south part you have Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, these other countries. But these three countries are the ones who actually the main senders of migrants in the last decades. So what you will say the political economy, these are very poor countries who during the 80s and 90s suffered terrible civil wars. Honduras did not, but also suffered like another type of violence. But these are countries who are very poor, very weak states, and also like have like I would say very corrupt governments, but at the same time they have been like in the eye in the eye of the United States, in the political spheres. I think the US has been very involved in trying to control them. So now the migration from these countries was relatively low from the 80s and 90s. Most of the ones who came were because they were like refugees from civil war, or they had like special like specific events are the ones who triggered. It started to ramp out, to start to increase in the 2000s, the 90s, and when the actually dislocation of the economy and the increasing development of these countries start to kind of move people out of the rural areas to urban areas, and then from urban areas to seeking more opportunities abroad. Usually, there was a seasonal migration, at least in Guatemala, from Guatemala to Mexico to work in the coffee industry. That was huge, but it was Mexico mostly. However, in the 90s, we start to see this increasing migration from Central America and to the US. And what you see since then is that Mexico start to becoming the border patrol of the US for this kind of migrants, which is very ironic because Mexico was also a country that sent migrants to the US, but at the same time was being the police for the US to stop migrants from Central America. And this has been just increasing and increasing. In the beginning, it was just mostly like local police in the border who were trying to prevent people from Central America to cross to Mexico so that they could enter. In the 90s and 2000s, for example, have you heard, I don't know if you know about the train, the cargo train that moves goods from south to north of Mexico, and migrants used to jump on top of it. That still exists, but it's not as huge as it was. Then eventually, Mexico started to invest more in infrastructure to put more checkpoints along the border to prevent like the free movement of undocumented migrants. It started to put more visa restrictions. And in 2015, for example, this is one of like right after the migrant crisis, Mexico implemented the South Border Plan, which means like even more infrastructure on migration management. And this was at the expense of the US. Now this is very tricky to say because we haven't found explicit proof that the US was funding this program, but it's pretty obvious, and as doing my talks, during my interviews with stakeholders, with like politicians, they all agree that Mexico has no interest in stopping Central Americans other than helping and supporting the US. So there is generally consensus that the US puts a lot of pressure in making Mexico its own border, external border, if you want to call it, so to prevent Central Americans from coming. So yeah, these are countries who are very poor. If you talk about migrant network theory, these are countries who have a lot of people who can potentially come to the US who are coming, right? So there is a lot of young people, like the ones that I interviewed. There is a lot of need. There is a lot of violence, a lot of push factors, and the networks are right now at their apex. So it's not the same compared to Mexican migration, which we are seeing a decline, a kind of like a change in the demographics, if you want to call it. So yeah.
So there's something, as you mentioned, that changed, I guess, in the late 90s and early 2000s, that made this migration be perceived as necessary and unavoidable. So you mentioned in your research that there's a lot of violence, I guess gang violence, in the neighborhoods in these Northern Triangle countries. Yeah, so how do these gangs come about? Like how do they, like, what's their economic model? How do they recruit the local population? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, these gangs were originated from the first wave of Central Americans that moved to the US, who ended up in Los Angeles, LA, California. And when Central Americans arrived to this city, they found themselves in between two other big groups, which were Mexican or Mexican Americans, and also like African Americans, who were living there. And the places in which they were like gang territories, So what Central Americans did is that they formed their own gangs to protect themselves. Now it's very interesting because what happens is, like, at some point the LA government, I think, for what I can remember from my readings, it was during the Olympic Games, LA Olympic Games. The LA government, in an attempt to take out the bad apples from LA, deported this massive amount of Central Americans who were Salvadorans who were living in LA, and they sent them back. But this is people who have been living for like decades in Los Angeles, who were very used to this like gang culture. They reached El Salvador, and what they found is this country who is, like, was barely escaping the civil war, like was like scrambling, very poor infrastructure, very poor government. and they found that they could thrive. They could recruit more people. They could use like extortion, kidnapping to get more and more and more money. But I have to say this: many people think that in Central America, gangs are like one thing, like one big institution, which is to a certain extent true, but it's at the same time what we have is like different kind of cells, different kind of groups who are operating in their own regions, and sometimes they don't even have contact with others, but they have a very like symbolic culture, of like going to new areas, of expanding their territory. Now you ask me, what do they do? What is their economy? How do they operate? During the first period, I would say most of the money they had came from extortion, like local business, government. Then, because the Central American turned into a pathway for crossing drugs from Colombia, then you can see how gangs develop into more like the crossing of drugs. Also like participating in the industry, and now it's kind of like a mix. Now they are also like moving people. They're also moving migrants. They're also in this business or controlling territories and kind of charging a fee for anyone who wants to cross Central America. For example, if you come from Haiti or if you come from like Colombia, some of these gangs actually charge people for the crossing. They recruit heavily on the poor areas of Central America with youth. And they usually, as this is more like gang studies, but they offer an identity, for some certain youth whose parents are here or who are very, are doing bad at school or don't have anything to do, or they don't feel that they have a connection with their families or with other forms of other groups. And gangs usually offer them power, offer them like a sense of belonging. And this is something very, very common. It started in El Salvador and then spread it into to Honduras, and then went to Guatemala. Now it's all over these three countries. I found something very interesting, which is the time I spent in the border between Nicaragua and Honduras, because my question is like, why there are no gang members in Nicaragua, right? Because it's also a country who is kind of similar to. And what I found is like at the border, you see the army, it's like tailoring, who is like profiling in the border anyone who looks like a gang member, and they are like, as soon as they see someone who has tattoos or who dresses the same way, they stop them and they interrogate them. So you can tell, for what I can tell, Nicaragua is very aware of these groups and tries to prevent their arrival. But in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, they are huge. They are huge. They are like a huge presence. They have a lot of power because they are everywhere. They are in the streets, and because the state is relatively weak, can do much about it. They are also very, very violent. Part of their culture is to do little violence, to make their point. So for example, during my study, I saw that at least 70% of the kids that I met know someone personally. They personally know someone who has been killed by gang members, and by personally means like family members, and the way they do it is usually pretty horrible. So they try to make violence very explicit to make the point to create terror. It's pretty sad. And another interesting thing that I saw is that, which is sad, is that many of these youth that I met, and I met a couple who were members, they have a relatively short period of life. There's a lot of risk because they're always fighting with other gangs. And when I had the chance to talk to an ex-gang member in El Salvador, and what he told me pretty much is like, I think I'm just lucky to be alive. And when I was young, I didn't know what to do. But as soon as I turned like 24 or 25, I realized that all my friends were gone, were dead, And I start to realize that what I'm doing here, what is that I am doing in this organization, right? And because there's a lot of violence, but they also suffer a lot of violence, from all the different places, from other gangs, from their own members, Uh, uh, yeah, I mean, this guy who I met, he told me like some of his friends were killed by other gang members, others died from overdoses of cocaine or stuff like that. So yeah, it's a very it uses a lot of young people, but it's also not something that you can do forever, because if you keep having this lifestyle, eventually something will happen to you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very troublesome lifestyle. I mean, so and it's pretty clear. I mean, how young people are being coerced into joining. There would be threats that you detailed in your internal migration paper, right? So where I guess these kids, they move to a relative, I guess within the same country, different neighborhood or different city, different town, but they're being preyed upon by the I guess the gang members in the new communities that they move into. So that's quite disturbing. But then okay, so but then you also mentioned that there's cases of people that are able to leave the gangs. I mean, how would
Yeah,
that actually be
yeah.
possible?
Well, number one, there are different ways. Well, the most common way is you escape. You just leave that day and just run north, and try to escape the territory. Uh, but first, there are different ways, ways to be involved in this gang. Like, for what I saw, many of them start as something they call watcher, or like hawks, HAWK hawks. Like people who are just at certain points trying to see if the police is coming, the army is coming, and as soon as they know, they just call the bosses, and the leader of the gang. Like, oh, someone is coming. That doesn't mean that you are part of the gang. That means that you work for them. Now, to enter a gang, at least in Central America, you have to have like a recall, and at least the one that I the one that I know is for the 13 gang. The ritual is that the main members of the group will beat you for 13 seconds. They will like smash you until they get exhausted for 13 seconds. Once you pass that, then you are one of them. Or then you have to kill someone to go to the next level. All these different stages. Not all of them reach that area. For example, one kid passed the first level, but when he was asked to kill, he says like, "I cannot do it. I cannot kill anyone." But then when you don't do it, then those gang members see you as traitor, and then they start to chase you or to try to kill you, and that's when they escape. And that's what happens. Usually, they once they decide that they have to do it, they usually do it at night, or they do it like hidden between cars to escape the territory. And because sometimes there is communication between groups, they try to be incognito all over until they reach the Mexican border. Because once they reach the Mexican border, they feel safe. But they feel like anyone who sees them uh, might call someone that knows someone, and then they will be stopped. Something that is interesting in Central America is that youth from 12 to 17-year-old are seen, especially poor, precarious youth, are always perceived as potential gang members. So, for example, if you are a youth that is moving to another area, let's say that you're in a different town, and some gang member sees you and recognizes that you are not from there, he will probably stop you and interrogate you and try to find where you're from. Once he finds out where you're from, what's your name, he probably will try to call someone to see what happens, right? And if the person who is the contact in this other town where you're from says like, "Oh yeah, he just escaped," you should do this to him, then you're in trouble. You know what I'm saying? So it can be pretty bad. So they are always, especially the ones who are escaping gang violence, are always like moving in the most secretive way to try to avoid any presence, to try to avoid any lead tracks of their movement. So, yeah.
Okay, it's quite scary. So in these Northern Triangle countries, I mean, if we go away from the I guess the gang culture, the gang economy. I mean, is there such a thing as a regular economy? Maybe agriculture or fishing or other industries as well. And I mean, you mentioned in your research that poverty is one of the main drivers of migration. So maybe talk a little bit about, like what are I guess, the non-gang industries in the Northern Triangle countries.
Well, it depends. Most there is the home economy, right? Which means like you have a piece of land that you farm and you sell the few things that you can farm from there, but you don't have like a formal salary, right? Uh, Talking about from the rural perspective. Um, then you have, for example, people who work in kind of seasonal like farming. For example, banana, coffee, sugar cane. And those are usually big. What do you say? Big, big plantations, if you want to call it. But they usually hired by season, so it's just a period of 3 or 4 months in which you get hired, and you work really hard, and you can make quite a good amount of money, but just for a certain period of time. This is the rural area. Now there's a lot of people move internally, move from rural to urban areas, and then it varies. It depends on your skills. Many people move in the periphery and work like in service, like work, like masons, or like I don't know, like working like in selling, or like working as helpers of like other. Uh, I'm talking about youth people, like young people, or they work like selling, like I don't know, hats or food in the streets, or in food markets. This is mostly for youth. Uh, there is also the industry. For example, Salvador has a textile industry. Also, Guatemala has a little bit of textile industry, from like I don't know, Levi's, or like these big corporations. But yes, usually for kind of adults, people with a little higher, older. But these salaries are very precarious. Something that I found in my research is like there is never enough money. The salaries are not enough. And even for those who in the rural areas, it's definitely not enough. Usually, you just keep the same living standard that you had, with your parents. If you move to an urban area, then you increase your salary, but you also have to pay for your food. You have to pay for your room. You have to send money to your parents, and then these poor kids are again in this situation in which they cannot save money. They're also exploited. They have to work, like 12-hour shifts, or sometimes they don't get paid enough. There's a lot of exploitation among them. So yeah, they, especially for youth, there are no opportunities, and the opportunities available are either not well paid, or the conditions are pretty bad. And in the case of girls, they suffer a lot of sexual harassment. There is tons of sexual harassment among these girls that move internally from rural to urban areas, but also the ones who are in rural areas. So yeah, it's definitely no a future if you want to see. And you have to think that for youth are in a period in which they want to grow. They want to become like independent. They want to have a family. Perhaps they want to, like, they have dreams about studying, like buying a car. And I I I guarantee you that it will be hard to find a youth who is not, of course, the high class, but in Central America, that will tell you that they have a future in Central America. Many of them don't see any future at all.
So what's the overall class structure in those societies? Because I mean, obviously, like, because when you mentioned that, okay, migration is a big motivation, but especially if you're poor. But I must assume that there is like an upper class, right? Maybe people that own land and they have people that work under them, or people who own these like big industries like the jeans, textile, etc. So talk a little bit about the overall class structure in those countries.
Yeah, it depends. For example, you have the generally 70% are in a very precarious situation, and I would say around 20% are kind of like the middle, and then you have like 10% or like even I would say 5 or even less percent who are in the high class, who are the high class. Uh, Usually the high class is kind of like a mix between three areas, which is politicians, those who want to control power, uh, then rural leaders or rural people who own the land, who own this like big agricultural corporations, who live in urban areas, and then the army. The army is also another big group that holds a lot of power and holds a lot of money. So we have this group. In the middle, you have mostly urban middle class, if you want to call it. This kind of like very like because rural areas are usually very polarized, very very rich and poor. In the cities, you have like kind of this middle ring of people who are like teachers, kind of like new doctors, like lawyers. They have this, and then you have all the other people who perhaps have less skills, have lower salaries, and they usually work in services like basic services. Um, Something that it's interesting for me when I've seen the development in Central America is that the increasing rely on private security that the elites are having, or like certain, it's hard to imagine this, but for example, many neighborhoods, actually everyone, all neighborhoods do it now. They try to get as much private security as possible, and it depends on how much money you have. It depends on what kind of security you have. For example, in the richest neighborhoods that I was able to see, those are fortress. There's like walls and like people with guns, like no one can enter. Then if you go to lower, then you have people with like four-wheelers with guns who are around the area. Everybody pays a monthly fee, so then you can have these people, and even the lower neighborhoods have someone with a whistle who will alert if someone, so everybody hires as much security as possible. But there's more and more presence of higher like more sophisticated private security in Central America, because as inequality grows, there's more pressure for these people to protect their privilege. So yeah, it's pretty dramatic when you see, and for example, you see, for example, very strange to see, like, I don't know, grocery stores that are protected with people who look like army soldiers. There's like 3 or 4 like very armored heavy police who are in front of a grocery store, and you think, okay, what's going to happen here, right? This is becoming more and more common because there's more pressure for these places to preserve their security.
Right. I mean, because I mean, ultimately, I think it boils down to the main problem of so too much inequality, also weak state institutions, right? Because then you cannot have welfare services or taxes to basically even out the imbalances. And right, so that leaves
Yeah.
migration as the only uh available route. um and but then at the same time, I mean, you mentioned that there is a change in the legal strategy by the US and the Mexican government vis-a-vis the Northern Triangle migrants, and they're basically not wanting to allow too many migrants to come in. And yeah, so I mean, so what do you see as the prospect for immigration policy from the U.S. perspective? I mean, imagine that you were sort of like an advisor to either the Mexican or the U.S. government. I mean, would you tell them, like, we should allow more people to come in, and this is for humanitarian reasons because we cannot solve their economic problems, or what would be your approach?
Uh, it's pretty complex of migration, like and nation buildings, like nation building its own like uh, protecting his privilege, perhaps, if you want to call it, like the US or Europe, you want to call it. I, First, I want to say that so the US have this old set, the US government has this set of laws, right? Refugee law, like they look nice in paper, right? And they have, and it's very interesting because no matter how much, like, how fancy is your law to protect immigrants once they reach the border, it will not work if they cannot reach the border, right? So it's very like kind of like ironic that making working in better immigration law will, will not help anyone that will not reach the border, and that the US is doing both. It's trying to improve this immigration system, and at the same time, it's trying to prevent anyone from reaching the border and benefit from this system of protection that the US can offer, right? And so something that David Fitzgerald in his book calls refugees beyond reach, right? Because you have laws, you have access to refugee, but it's beyond reach. Mexico has becoming more and more key. It has a key role in stopping Central American migration. If Mexico today, if the president of Mexico today calls his, I don't know, everyone in the government and says, "Do not stop migrants," uh, I can guarantee you that the U.S. border will collapse in 3 or 4 days, perhaps even faster. Is And I will say that the U.S. knows that. So I can imagine that the U.S. puts a lot of pressure, telling you either you do this, because if you don't do this, I will sanction you, or affect you another way, right? But my point is, if the U.S. really doesn't want it here in the U.S., if that's kind of the goal, why not, instead of investing in militarization, instead of investing on border enforcement, why not invest in a more smart way in Mexico who offers these migrants a place to stay, right? Why not think differently about the role of Mexico? I don't think that, of course, means that Mexico will have to agree to it, to let migrants to stay in Mexico. But that's already happening. They are already staying in Mexico because they cannot move anymore. So it's already happening. Why not invest in programs in, like, different type of development? That has a caveat, which is that, as you know, or many know, the main driver of international migration is sometimes it's migrant networks, right? So people are coming to the U.S. because they have opportunities, but also because they know someone here, who can help them to establish, who has told them or talked to them about the different type of benefits of coming here. So why, instead of not letting them come here, why we cannot do some sort of like circular migration, like work permits, for those who are coming here to work? Why can we not make, seasonal jobs? Of course, for that, we all have to agree to let them work here, to provide them with like a decent salary instead of like a precarious salary. Are we willing to do that, or we want to keep having a huge workforce that is illegal and we can, exploit without mercy? Well, that's kind of like a consensus that the entire nation has to like debate. But this is for the economic aspect. Now for the violence, those who are escaping violence, I think that many of them do not want to return to Central America. They miss it, but they definitely don't see. And violence is something to, if you want to tackle, if you want to really change things, it will take a long time, And someone who is escaping a death threat cannot wait 10 years to see if things change, right? So I do think we should receive them. I do think there's a lot of opportunity. These Jews, if what's the main reason that why they are coming to the US, at least according to my data? Ironically, is not necessarily because violence or because economic opportunity. Is to study. They say, I want to study in the US. I know that it's got to study. I think it's good education here. And even if I haven't finished high school, I want to go to high school. I want to become a doctor. I want to become, youth have a huge, future, and they are eager to learn, they are eager to become better members of the society, So I keep saying that you never know. Maybe one of these youth who are crossing the border and you see, crossing the river, maybe he will be your future doctor. Maybe she will be your future nurse. Maybe we are in the U.S. it's a society that is aging. That is becoming older and older. We need to have more people, but also we need to be fair with the people that once they are here, right? We need to provide them with enough opportunities so they can prosper. And we should stop using Mexico, because as we can see right now, as of last week, we again reached the maximum number of arrivals at the U.S. border here in any given year. So we have never reached as many migrants as we are reaching right now. What does that mean? It means that it doesn't work. That using Mexico to stop migrants might stop them for a while, but it cannot stop them forever. It cannot really reduce migration completely. The only thing that Mexico does is making people suffer while they are moving. Like really creates a lot of pain on these people. Like the things that I've seen rape, I've seen extortion, I've seen mutilation. All these costs because the way Mexico is treating these migrants who the only thing they want to do is move. The only thing they want to do is to find a better future. So if you want to know something, border enforcement doesn't stop migration. There are bigger forces that are the drivers of this. Border enforcement just creates more violence, just makes people suffer more.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit more about what the context of reception is in Mexico? So you talk a lot about the suffering that the migrants are experiencing while they're in Mexico, trying to pass through the country and get into U.S. So why is it currently so dangerous for the Central American migrants passing through Mexico?
Yeah. Well, something interesting about youth is like, or children, is like generally people are more, they feel more mercy for children, or for young girls, or for young boys, So even if they are immigrants, even if they are documented, in Mexico, we're still not everyone is really into like seeing youth as gang members, for example. They do recognize that they live in a precarious situation, that they are a vulnerable group. So during my conversations with people in Mexico in the different parts, generally when they see youth and kids, they feel bad about it. Now there has been a transformation. When I started my research in 2015, many people still thought that migrants were just moving. They were like, "Oh, it's so sad," that I can see them at the bus stations, or like I can see them being, in the streets walking. They did not realize what was happening in reality. What was happening is like people Central Americans were start to stay in these areas. Start to create like a way of living. Either because they, for example, I can give you two examples. Because they decided to don't keep moving anymore. For example, I met a father and son that stay in a town in central Mexico because after a shocking experience with gang members in central Mexico, they decide that they will not like to keep going to the U.S. and risking their life. They decide to stay and work in haircut because the father was like an expert, a hairdresser, sorry. And he was just making a living there, and what happens when you, instead of moving, you are working, in a place, then you start to think differently about this place, right? You see it more like a home, right? And his idea was like, well, actually, I like Mexico. Maybe I don't want to leave anymore to the US. It's enough for me for now. I'm telling you this because now all over Mexico, there are pockets of communities of Central Americans who are settling, but now things change because once a migrant is not anymore moving, but instead is staying, it's in your neighborhood, it's in your neighborhood, it's like eating with you, then you start to see more discrimination, more negative comments. During my last fieldwork in 2019, and that's the big fieldwork that I had, I start to see that taxi drivers, people were saying, I don't think they should stay. I don't think we should let them be here. There are too many of them. They are changing our culture. There's more negative comments. So Mexico is now finally realizing that migrants are staying. In the border is more obvious because you have this big concentration. That is happening all over Mexico. But there is one more thing that is happening, which is that by making Mexico more and more restrictive to movement, they are forcing migrants to move to other areas, new areas that were usually unaware of this movement. And that's creating an industry because it's profit. If people want to move and they cannot, then suddenly a taxi driver in a town realizes that he can charge 3 times as much for a migrant that just to move him from place A to B. So then many of these towns in Mexico now they are realizing that they can profit from this movement. And that's creating like a new set of groups or new set of industry, people who are getting paid to different amounts of money, who are now, this is fascinating to me, they are groups, for example, in my home state, Chiapas, there are groups of like people who, for example, who know that they can profit from me. So now they are trying to contact people in Central America to try to bring more migrants to keep fueling their business. This just happened because migrants were forced to move to this town to avoid the main border enforcement that is happening in the common routes of migration. So it's a lot going on in Mexico, but I feel Mexico has a huge challenge, and sadly, I don't see really a big future. I feel like the more and more Central Americans are, the more their presence is visible, the more will be, these negative comments. And I really hope that politicians do not use this sense of discomfort that Mexican society has for their benefit. I feel like I hope that instead they kind of try to see something more close to integration, or comprehension of why is that these groups are staying in Mexico instead of moving.
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely see that there's a conflict between the, I guess the pro-migrant industry, I guess the smuggling industry, you can call them, versus the objectives of the government, which is to reduce the migration flows. Is there like in any way where we can see the conflict playing out between the smuggling industry and the government? How does that conflict play out? I mean, or is it just all implicit?
You mean if there is collaboration, or how do they relate to each other?
Yeah, exactly. Between the state government that has the mandate to reduce migration, right, versus the smuggling industry, which wants to increase it. I mean, you can definitely see there's a conflict, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. First, there's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, like right now, as far as I know right now, if you want to cross Mexico from Central America and reach the US with the help of a smuggling network, you have to pay around $8,000 to $12,000 per person. That's a lot of money. Think about it. It's a lot of money. Multiply this by hundreds of thousands. And you're talking about a big industry. There are cases of corruption. There are cases of collusion between organized crime and government. Everybody wants a piece. Everybody wants a piece of the cake. If you want to say it, everybody wants to take some from them. So either there is collusion and like the organized crime pays a fee to the government to let migrants cross in one way, but also like many of officers, immigration officers, also army. I think that also like bribe, receive bribes or like take money out of those migrants who are being apprehended. So I would say they both government and organized crimes operate at the same level. The only difference, perhaps, is that the result. I would say the government has to deliver, right? The government has to show that the numbers are low, and that's pretty obvious if you see the U.S. border, right? If more people arrive to the U.S. border, it means like something is happening down there, and the government is not doing the job, technically, right? Instead, the so-called migrant industry usually relies on its reputation, right? So the reason you pay $10,000 or $8,000 to smuggler is because there is certain like security that you will make it, right? So smugglers usually try to make people reach the border because that assures others who are in Central America that if they hire their services, they can make it, right? And this is now for like the ones who are like local, who are like more rovering or anything. That's usually based on how much people passes, how much they can pray for them, try to, and migrants are like a cat and mouse, they are running out of them and they are trying to chase them. And there is another actor that I forgot about mentioning, which is the drug cartels. Drug cartels in northern areas are realizing that moving migrants can be as profitable as moving drugs, and now they fight for territories, they fight for like the control of people who are moving, So you see a lot of in the north part, especially, how a lot of drug cartels are like now saying that their territory is not just about moving drugs; it's also their territory for moving people. And anyone who has to move people to this area, anyone who has to cross the border in the area that they control, has to pay a fee, and that means money from them, money that Yeah. So again, it's pretty much everybody wants to take as much as they can from them, and I will say like this happens at any level, like local stores, local stores that know that Central Americans don't know the currency exchange. They charge them twice or three times as much for groceries, or they charge them, or they know that they have a necessity to buy water, to buy certain products. They profit more. So it's a case of putting people in a vulnerable situation, and then how people realize and takes advantage of it. The other thing that I'm telling you is that the more enforcement the U.S. puts in Mexico, the more pressure, the higher the price will be to cross, the higher, because they have to pay more, which means like there is more money in the industry. And if there's more money in the industry, there's more interest to keep the industry alive, right? There is more interest to do things around, right? So again, enforcement doesn't really change much of the costs and what facilitates migration. Yeah.
I mean, just a related point, I guess, sticking with the drug policy. I mean, I'm sure you heard recently the announcement by the Biden administration to, I guess, decriminalize weed, marijuana, and basically no longer charge the possession of marijuana as a federal crime. I believe, states maybe have their own policies still. But do you think that this change in the U.S. drug policy would have ultimately an impact on the whole drug supply industry that goes through Central America?
I mean, I'm definitely not an expert. What I understood is like one thing is like marijuana, another thing is cocaine, and there's all the synthetic. So each one is different, has a different. So I don't know exactly what Biden wants to. I think marijuana is what he's talking about mostly, right?
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah, and I guess he will take out that business, but not the other business, the business of cocaine. It comes from Colombia. So yes, I guess it will help. It will definitely hurt them. because suddenly it will take out a big part of the profit. But what about the other drugs, that are still in the uh, you know illegal, and there's going to keep the smuggling is going to keep happening just because there's a need here for this kind of drug. Now, yeah, should we legalize cocaine and other stuff? I'm not an expert, but I don't know. I let's say that they legalize everything, right? Let's make a hypothesis. Um, it will definitely definitely impact the entire movement of drug that is happening in Mexico. Um,
Right.
Definitely.
You'll be able to hit the cartels and the business model, but I mean then you also, I mean, as a policymaker, you have to consider the flip side of those policies, right? I mean
Mhm.
if the ease of access increases, then because the trouble is, I mean, that once you have easy access to the gateway drugs, I mean, particularly people who they have trauma in their lives, they have bad experiences, and this could be a gateway drug to its basically a life of addiction, which is
Yeah.
incredibly bad for individuals, for the families, for GDP and everything else. So um I mean, so I'm more of the opinion that drug addiction should be like it should be like more like a public health policy rather than criminal justice. So I
Yes.
mean, I'm definitely not in the camp of like we should approve of everything, at least on a social level. But I think but the problem is if you make it only like a criminal justice, like a law enforcement approach, that you reinforce things like the smuggling and strengthening of the cartels,
Yeah.
and that's it's maybe something that is more problematic as a policy. But I do
I guess
understand
you
that
could.
impact.
What about a more economic approach? What if we? I mean, this is just using my sociological skills. What if you make it legal, but you tax it? You put a huge tax tag on it, on these drugs. What if you say like, I mean, this is of course an hypothesis. What if you say, okay, I'm going to make cocaine legal, but I'm going to tax it, at 1,000% to make it very expensive to cover it. That's just one of these things that you can do, right? Perhaps that will eliminate, and people will pay it. Although you probably will create a black market that will do it for cheaper or something like that. But I'm trying to see options, to see how we can like manage this in a better way that is not from the perspective of crime, as you mentioned. That's the only thing that occurs to me. Tax it, tax it to see if we can like reduce consumption. And it's still regulated. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would be in favor of the high taxation, but as you mentioned, I mean, everything is a trade-off. That is to say, I mean, you make the tax too high, and then that's it creates the black market. I mean, well, we already have the black market under the illegal regime,
Yeah,
right? So it's, I mean, everything has to be calibrated the right way. I believe that tax is certainly part of it. And I think I would also be in favor of like dedicating the tax money to specific purposes to deal with drug addiction, to I don't know, hire mental health counselors and
yeah,
like drug addiction treatments, and also, yeah, it's about maybe, I mean, like the biggest problem is like the hopelessness, right? I mean, if people think that their life is hopeless, then they tend to take the drugs. I mean, I was looking at a book recently. It was about fentanyl addiction, which, I mean, if you looked at the numbers, I mean, it just went up like crazy. I would say maybe since 2015, I want to say. So right around the time when you were studying the migrant border issue, we are seeing a massive increase in the deaths of
mhm,
fentanyl addiction. And the reason why it's so troublesome is because fentanyl, which is the deadly substance, is being mixed into cocaine, marijuana, and I mean other kinds of drugs that might not have the same lethality, and then people who consume those could consume the fentanyl through other drugs inadvertently. They die from it. And yeah, do you know anything about it? I mean, how like these I guess these are the drug cartels who are doing that, right? I mean, they're working to inject
I honestly,
fentanyl into other drugs.
I really don't know. There is a, I don't know. I saw a couple. I saw one in the border in Tijuana. I saw a couple of, not a couple, like a group of migrants who get stranded in the border who were addicts. I have to say that I never seen people acting like that in my life. It's not like the same as cocaine or as marijuana. They were acting differently. And when I asked why were they, I thought they had some mental problem. And I asked the friend who was with me, what's happening? And like, no, they just got addicted to fentanyl. And I was like, oh wow. And apparently, what happens is like because Tijuana is the crossing area for drugs to California. Uh, some of these drugs stays there, right, in the border, and ends it up in the hands of people who later become addicts. Uh, I don't know. I was terrified about it. I was like, this is something different. At the same time, I don't. I mean, I don't know enough, but I wonder. You can ask this question. Not everyone is an addict. What happens if I do it? Will I become an addict? Is 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 that power? Is this fentanyl that powerful that everyone just will become an addict, or is it more about the social circumstances around people who are already in a position to become addicted to this kind of drugs? You know what I'm saying? So you approach it like that, then perhaps it's about providing people with a certain a certain quality of life, so that they don't fall in the hands, even if they try. Uh, you know what I'm saying? Because my impression was like there are certain migrants who ended up in the border, they get stranded, they become hopeless because they cannot cross anymore, and then they start to take these drugs. But I was thinking more about maybe it's more about related to other factors of their life, about depression, about precarity, about poverty, about other areas. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I
it's
mean,
pretty bad.
I think hopelessness is definitely one factor. I mean, for instance, I mean, over here, I mean, in a college town like in Ithaca or in Princeton, I mean, I barely see any drug addicts. While I mean, if you go to I don't know, rural Appalachia, or I guess the people that you met in Tijuana, you might see more of these cases. So I think it's definitely the social context, the socioeconomic status, the individual circumstances of poverty, desperation, like a lack of income, hope. Yeah, that's certainly one of the necessary conditions. But then I think it cannot be underestimated. I mean, how perfidious also the drug cartels are operating to basically mix up the drugs. The sort of the more innocuous ones with the more lethal ones. And
Yeah,
there has to be so at the level of drug policy. I think yeah, we definitely need much better interventions. But I would certainly agree. I think the demand should be the focus should be on the demand side. How do you you know smartly decrease the demand for drugs? Um, yeah, but I wouldn't fully give up on the supply side. I mean, like, can we figure out ways how to you know uh you know I don't know, reduce the production of things like fentanyl, some ways. But the U.S. government doesn't have good experience, right? I mean,
Yeah,
whenever they said we
definitely.
wanted to invest in, like, I don't know, law
Yeah,
enforcement in Colombia or something like that, it usually hasn't decreased the drug production at all.
yeah,
Yeah, no, it's not a hopeful
yeah,
story.
and it makes sense. It makes sense because I mean it's a lot of money. It's tons of money. You know? And think about it. What would these groups do if suddenly they don't stop receiving the income that they get from drugs? What do you think they're going to do, right? Uh, you know, what are their skills? So I really wonder. I mean, of course, my dream will be that there will be no escalation, but I always wonder what these groups are going to do, what the criminal groups are going to do. Suddenly, they don't have a way of living, right? Will they become more to extortion? Will they become more to kidnapping people? They have to find a way, and the only thing they know how to do is how to operate a drug cartel. So I doubt that they will turn into other industry, that fast. So I think you have to also think about that, like as the more you close the market, the profit, what options are available for them, and
Yeah,
you
it's
often find the case that ex-police members, like ex-army soldiers, become part of this organized crimes, and there is a reason for it because they do
because the pension is very
they do
low, I
very
guess, that
similar
they're
things,
getting.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
but they also know how to use weapons. They know, all these tactics. I mean, they can transfer their skills pretty easily from one business to another. You know, uh,
Yeah,
so yeah,
it's incredibly concerning. Okay, so that's enough of the drug topic. I mean, so again, back to this migration issue, because the I mean, if you look at the last few, American election cycles, right, so the border issue, I mean, it's always, comes and goes to some extent, but certainly I would say maybe the Trump era would probably be the first one where, um, like, sort of this ideal of, like America being sort of a migration country, has sort of been, um, put into question. I mean, it's of course a particular, migration that he's opposing. I mean, Trump was quite explicit that he wanted European migrants, white immigrants, to continue coming in. But basically, if they come from other parts of the world, then maybe uh, he's more skeptical of that. Uh, yeah, but then at the same time, I mean, if you look at the demographic reports, it was saying that the it's only a minority of births that are happening in this country by white non-Hispanic. So I mean, essentially, I mean, there's already a demographic transition that is happening in the U.S. Through, increase in the Hispanic population and then the Asian population. Yeah, I mean, so it is quite complex, right? Where you know, yeah, I mean, the key point seems to be here that migration and race are intersecting here, right? In terms of the immigration discourse, and that you know that anti-migrant discourse is in fact highly racialized, and that makes it very difficult to uh, to promote more sensible policies, like what you mentioned. Can we increase the number of like visas to, let's say, Northern Triangle country nationals? Um, yeah. So how do you view the broader immigration debate in this country?
I mean, in terms of race, yeah. I mean, it's interesting to see how, yeah, we're founded in a society that was economically based on slavery and symbolically define himself as either white or black, and then Latinos enter like who are in this kind of middle ground, but at the same time they're diverse with their own history and their own past and race uh, ideas, their own racism, their own boundaries, social boundaries, if you want to call it. But now we have Latin Americans in the U.S. We have Latinos. What I want to say is that we have second and third generation Latinos. We have like recently arrived immigrants. It's pretty different. So my first caveat will be to don't generalize Latinos in the U.S. They very different. There are some who are like quite already incorporated. Some who perhaps their great grandparents were immigrants, but they don't feel like that anymore. They feel fully Americans. Whether they are treated like that or not, that's different. Maybe they do feel like that. Then you have, for example, like state identities, like Texan Latinos or like Cuban Floridans who are like conservative, and you don't expect that. You expect that all Latinos are going to be liberal. So it's very diverse. I will say that, as many other scholars have pointed out, the issue with Latin American immigration to the U.S. is the issue of legality, of being documented or being undocumented. And regardless of I think regardless of the color, even, it's like we should fight for a more fair way to be in this country while it's not just being undocumented, for those who are undocumented, because those are the ones who really are affected the most, and in a more vulnerable situation. Now, in terms of race, whether we can do it or not, I feel we are reaching a good momentum. There is more and more awareness. There are more and more organizations that are fighting for this type of reform, immigration reform, that perhaps opens a pathway for legalizations to millions and millions of migrants. But at the same time, reforms have shown that nothing changes, that in the long term, like the 1980s, the IRA reform, the IRA reform, legalized millions of undocumented immigrants, mostly Mexicans and from other parts of Latin America. However, now we are in the same problem again. After 20 and so years, we're having the same problem of having a large population of undocumented migrants. So I will say, as long as we keep having the same economic system that preys on undocumented migrants, on cheap labor force, we're going to keep having the same issue of undocumented migrants. Now, in terms of race, whether Latinos are going to be part of North America, whether I think that research has shown that it will depend. I've seen some studies who show that it will depend of literally the color skin. Perhaps darker Latinos are not going to be as accepted, or they're going to be considered as foreigners. White Latinos are going to perhaps be more easily incorporated, perhaps a language acquisition. I think it's going to be segmented. We're going to have different pockets of Latinos who are going to think differently. And what identities are going to be created out of these different pockets? That's, for me, the interesting question. I think at some point we are going to see that Latinos will start to be fragmented. We're already seeing it, but we are going to see, perhaps, for the collective idea of America to think about Latinos is going to start to have new labels to express the different identities. Perhaps we see something like, I don't know, Latino says like, we don't like immigrants from Latin America. Perhaps they find that, or perhaps they find something different. Perhaps they say, okay, we think Latinos are also Latin Americans, and we will, fight for open borders. I think for me that's going to be something that we should ask ourselves: what is going to be the Latino identity in the U.S. in the following years? Because that will define a lot about how the U.S. is going to deal with us. Because at the end, there is a lot of us. There are a lot of us here, so we have like a demographic power. But again, identity is not something straightforward. Identity is not something who's like permanent, to stay stable. It changes a lot.
Yeah, there was this article that I saw recently. It was about Latino voters that are supporting Republican Party, and that was, of course, connected, with the perception that the Democrats are too left wing, too socialistic, and I guess the idea is that many of the migrants, they I don't know, they like market competition, things that they used to not have when they grew up in their home countries. And they want to see more of that, and they think that the Republican Party is more like a free market libertarian party, and the party of like small businesses and hard work and individuality and so forth. And that means that it's not true that the overwhelming majority of Latino population is going to support Democratic Party, right? So it's a very complex, as you say. I mean, it's a complex demographic today, right? Okay, so I think that should call the podcast to an end. So I thank you very much, Angel, for coming on and sharing your time and wisdom to the world. Okay, and thank you very much.
No, thank you. Yeah, and yeah.